In this lesson, we're going to look at the function Date.AddDays. Now this is a handy little M-code function that adds or removes days onto or from a date or date time column of dates. So what we're going to do in this video is look at a standard invoice report that we might run out of an accounts payable system, and that shows invoices that as a company we might receive. We'll then take an invoice date column and then add on some days to get to a payment due date column. So we're going to do this in PowerQuery within Power BI, although of course we could also do this in PowerQuery in Excel if, for example, you're using pivot tables and Power Pivot rather than Power BI. So first of all, let's look at the syntax of the Date.AddDays function. Okay, so as for most M-code functions, we have the function type being date, as these functions all relate to data types, and then the name of the function being AddDays. Now after that, as our first parameter, we have the date value that we want to add our days to, or take away, because we can do that too with this function. And then as our second parameter, we have the number of days that we want to add or take away. So then underneath, we've got three examples here. The first one shows how we would add 10 days onto a literal. So a literal is where we define one particular date. The first parameter is our literal. The second parameter is our 10 days that we're then adding on. The second example here shows us adding 10 days onto an invoice date column. The first parameter is our invoice date column, and then the second parameter is our 10 days that we're adding on. Our function would then go through our invoice date column row by row, adding on 10 days to each date it finds in the date column. Then finally, our last example here takes off one day from each date in our invoice date column by adding here in the second parameter the number -1. So let's have a look at this in practice. Okay, here we are in PowerQuery in Power BI, and I've attached the file to some invoice data. So we're going to work in this query here called invoice, and this is a fact table showing some invoices that we've received. Now looking in the data set, we've got an invoice number, and then we've got an invoice date, and this is the column that we're interested in. Now what we don't have in this data set is a payment due date, so let's create that and assume that all our payment dates are 30 days from the invoice date. So to do that, we'll create a new column by clicking on Add Column, and then on Custom Column. Okay, so let's name this column Invoice Date plus 30 days. Okay, we've already got an equal sign in place, so we'll just add the function name Date.AddDays. And then open our brackets. Then we'll insert our column name, which is invoice date. And see how PowerQuery automatically inserts square brackets around the column name. We'll then put in a comma, and then add the number 30, which is the amount of days we're adding to our invoice date column. I'll just close the brackets, and we can see we've got no syntax errors that have been detected, so our function should be okay. I'll just click OK. Great, that's added our new column in at the end of the data set. Now before we move it next to the invoice date column, we'll convert the column to the date type just here in the formula bar. Okay, now let's just move the new column next to our invoice date column. Great, now we can easily see that we've added 30 days onto each row in the invoice date column. Okay, well that's a good example, but in reality most vendors frequently have different payment terms, so adding on a blanket 30 days probably won't really do the trick in most situations. So what we need is a column that has the payment terms in it for each invoice, which thankfully we actually already have. Here we go, it's this one here called payment terms. So let's create another column then, here that we'll call payment date. I'll go to the custom column button again. Okay, in goes the formula name. I'll open the brackets and then insert the invoice date field. And I'll put in our comma and put in our second parameter. Now this time, instead of adding a specific number of days, we're going to use the payment terms column instead. And now I'll close the brackets and press OK. Again, I'll just change the data type for this column. And now we can move it next to the invoice date field. I'll also move the payment terms column next to the invoice date field just so we can compare, just to make sure that the formula's done what we've expected. And there we go. We can now see that if we add the number of days in the payment terms column to the invoice date field, then we get the payment date field.